It was a quiet afternoon when the Whitley family disappeared, a story that would become one of the darkest unsolved mysteries in the town of Greendale. A family that had always been known for their warmth and close-knit ties. The Whitleys had no enemies, no debts, and certainly no reason to vanish without a trace. Yet, on that fateful night in 1983, they simply vanished. No signs of struggle, no notes, no clues, just an empty house. The family consisted of Thomas and Eliza Whitley, both in their early 40s, and their two children. Lucy, a bright-eyed 12-year-old, and her little brother Ben, only 8. They had lived in the same house for over a decade, nestled at the edge of Greendale, a picturesque little village surrounded by thick woods. Their life was simple but happy. Thomas worked as a local lawyer, Eliza ran a small antique shop, and the children were loved by their schoolmates. It was the kind of family you might expect to read about in a perfect storybook. Their house, an old Victorian-era cottage, with ivy creeping up the walls, was both charming and slightly eerie at night. The Whitley family had always been well-liked. In the neighborhood, Thomas was known for his generosity, often helping local families with legal matters for free. Eliza was equally beloved, always hosting gatherings at their home, offering warm meals, and giving advice to anyone who asked. Lucy and Ben were inseparable, their laughter and the sound of their running footsteps echoing down the quiet streets of Greendale. It was a perfect picture of family life in a quiet village. But in an instant, the pages turned dark. Neighbors recalled hearing the usual sounds of family life that evening. The laughter of children, the clinking of dishes, the hum of the television. The Whitley family had just finished dinner, and the children were playing a board game in the living room, their parents talking over cups of tea at the kitchen table. It was a peaceful scene, one that many could have walked by without giving it a second thought. But by morning the house was eerily silent. The door was wide open, the lights still on, and their beloved dog Daisy was left behind, sitting by the back door whimpering. Inside there were no signs of a hasty departure. The front door had been left ajar, the scent of breakfast still lingering in the air. The house was immaculate, nothing out of place. Their jackets hung on the coat hooks, the shoes neatly lined up near the door, and the children's toys were scattered where they had left them. But there were no signs of struggle, no broken windows, no indication that they had been taken by force. Neighbors rushed to the house when they noticed the door left open. It was unlike the Whitleys to leave anything unlocked, let alone open. The house had always felt safe, like a sanctuary where nothing bad could ever happen. Daisy, their loyal golden retriever, was still there, standing guard at the back door as if waiting for her owners to return. But Thomas, Eliza, Lucy and Ben were gone. Inside the house, everything was left undisturbed. The dinner table had been set, still awaiting the family's return, as if they had simply stepped away for a moment. Eliza's half-drunk cup of tea sat on the counter, still warm. The children's unfinished homework rested on the kitchen table, scattered around by a half-eaten apple. No signs of a struggle, just an empty home. A home that once echoed with the sounds of life. The authorities were called immediately, but their investigation yielded no lead. The police checked for any signs of forced entry, fingerprints, or anything that could point to foul play. But there was nothing. It was as though the Whitley family had vanished into thin air. No one had seen them leave. No one had heard any commotion. It was like they had simply disappeared without a trace. Rumors quickly spread throughout the village. Some said they had run away, perhaps fleeing from some unknown threat. Others believed it was a more sinister situation, kidnapping, or worse. But no ransom note ever arrived, and there was no indication that anyone had been taken by force. It was as if the Whitleys had just walked out, disappeared, left their lives behind, without any warning, any trace of what had truly happened. The police interviewed anyone who might have seen or heard something the night before, but no one could provide anything concrete. The Whitleys' neighbors described hearing the usual sounds that evening, the sound of children's laughter and voices coming from the house, the flickering lights of the TV in the living room. But by morning, everything was different. Silence had descended on the house. No one had seen them leave. The town of Greendale, once peaceful and quiet, was plunged into an uneasy silence. The Whitley family had vanished without a trace, and no one knew why or how. The police, desperate for answers, called in experts from across the country, but every investigation came to the same conclusion. The Whitleys had simply vanished. Their house was a shell, and the family had disappeared like a shadow. Days turned into weeks, and the mystery remained unsolved. The authorities searched through their personal lives, trying to find any reason, any clue, that could explain their disappearance, but everything pointed to one fact. The Whitleys were a family who had no reason to leave. No financial troubles, no enemies, no dangerous relationships, just a perfect family. As the case grew colder, the rumors started to become more outlandish. Some claimed the family had been abducted by aliens. Others whispered about a dark cult that had targeted the family. There were stories of hidden treasures and dangerous secrets, but no one could say for certain what had happened to the Whitleys. The disappearance of the Whitley family became a legend in Greendale, a story whispered behind closed doors, a mystery that no one could see. But what no one knew at the time was that their disappearance was just the beginning of something far darker, a story that would take decades to uncover, and one that would reveal secrets that no one was prepared to face. The disappearance of the Whitley family had shaken Greendale to its core. What was once a quiet, picturesque village was now alive with whispers and rumors. The police were desperate, but no leads seemed to surface. The case was quickly becoming the town's greatest mystery, and as the weeks turned into months, the fear began to spread, not just among the people who knew the Whitleys, but among everyone who lived in Greendale. The initial investigation yielded no immediate result. The police scoured the town for clues, questioning neighbors, family, and anyone who might have had any contact with the Whitleys in the days leading up to their disappearance. They combed through every inch of the house, looking for evidence that could explain what had happened. But as the days passed, their optimism began to fade, replaced by a cold reality. The Whitleys had simply vanished, leaving behind no explanation. The Whitley house, once a hub of warmth and love, had become a crime scene. Investigators arrived in droves, searching for anything that might provide a hint. They pulled up floorboards, checked the attic, and even searched the surrounding woods for miles, but all to no avail. The town of Greendale, once known for its peaceful tranquility, was now haunted by the question, where were the Whitleys? Days passed with no breakthroughs. The police began to shift their focus, trying to find any connection the family might have had with other towns or cities. They sent out alerts, hoping for a break. The case made local headlines, and soon reporters from larger cities began to trickle into Greendale. Journalists knocked on doors, desperate for any piece of information that might lead them to a story. But the people of Greendale were cautious. No one wanted to talk about the Whitleys. The more they did, the more the mystery seemed to grow. It wasn't long before a local reporter, Sarah Fields, began to dig deeper. Sarah had lived in Greendale her entire life, and she knew the Whitleys well. She'd grown up with Thomas and Eliza's children, Lucy and Ben, and though she wasn't close to the family anymore, the disappearance had left an undeniable mark on her. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this than just a family up and leave. Something had happened in that house, and Sarah was determined to find out what it was. Sarah began by interviewing people who had seen the Whitleys in the days leading up to their disappearance. She spoke with Thomas's colleagues, Eliza's shopkeepers, the children's friend. Everyone had something to say, but no one had anything that connected directly to their sudden disappearance. The most she could gather was that Thomas had seemed unusually distant in the days before he vanished. Eliza had seemed worried, but refused to speak about it. And the children, well, they'd been their usual selves, playing and laughing, as they always did. Nothing out of the ordinary. The most curious thing, however, was the Whitleys' final day in town. According to several witnesses, the family had gone to a small gathering at the local tavern. It wasn't unusual for them to attend these gatherings. Thomas would often mingle with townsfolk, discussing his work and the news of the day. Eliza would chat with the shop owners, and the children would play with their friends. But on this particular night, something was different. The bartender remembered the Whitleys leaving early, around 9 p.m. It was odd because they usually stayed longer. Eliza had seemed uneasy that night,
and Thomas had been unusually quiet. The children, however, were happy as usual, laughing and running around as if nothing was wrong. They all left together, and the bartender watched as the family walked out the door laughing. That was the last time anyone in town saw the Whitleys. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was as if they had walked out of town, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. But why? What had happened in those final hours? As the weeks dragged on, Sarah's investigation took a more personal turn. She began speaking to the people who lived closest to the Whitley family. These were the people who had the most insight into the family's daily lives, but even they seemed to be hiding something. One neighbor, Mrs. Graves, an elderly woman who lived 2 doors down from the Whitleys, was particularly unsettling. When Sarah spoke to her, Mrs. Graves was unusually vague. "I didn't see anything strange, dear," Mrs. Graves had said, her voice shaking. "The Whitleys were fine, just fine. They were good people, nothing unusual, I swear." Sarah pressed her for more information, but the elderly woman refused to speak. She was clearly uncomfortable. Sarah could see the fear in her eyes, and it made her wonder if the woman knew something. But what, and why was she so reluctant to speak? Frustrated, but determined, Sarah decided to revisit the Whitley house. The police had cleared it for investigation, and the house had been left untouched for weeks. It stood silent, just as it had on the night the Whitleys disappeared. But as Sarah stepped inside, she felt the house still smelled faintly of the Whitleys' meals, and the faint remnants of the children's toys lay scattered on the floor just as they had been when they left. It was as though time had frozen inside the house. She walked through the rooms, taking in the eerie quiet. There was no sign of a struggle. Nothing was out of place, but something about the house felt wrong. It was as if the walls themselves held a secret, a memory that had been buried beneath years of normal family life. As Sarah walked up to the 2nd floor, she came across something strange. It was a book, one of Lucy's picture books, left open on the floor beside the bed. It had been left carelessly, as if someone had been in the middle of reading it before leaving. But the thing that struck Sarah most was the page the book was open to. It was a picture of a family standing in front of a house, just like the Whitley family. Only something was different. In the corner of the image, barely visible, was a shadow, a dark figure that stood just outside the frame. Watch. The book had been left on purpose. That much was clear. But why? And why that image? She picked it up, her hands trembling. Was it a clue or a warning? She couldn't know for sure. But one thing was certain. The Whitley family's disappearance was far from a simple case. It was a mystery that had already begun to unravel, and Sarah was now at the heart of it. The more she uncovered, the more it seemed that the Whitley family wasn't just missing. They were and the deeper she dug, the more she realized that someone or something was trying to keep their story buried. As the investigation into the Whitley family's disappearance deepened, Sarah began to uncover connections that no one could have anticipated. It wasn't just the family's sudden vanishing that was unsettling. It was the eerie patterns that began to emerge as she retraced their footsteps. Sarah returned to the Whitley house once more, this time armed with her own suspicion. She scoured the place, her mind buzzing with the unsettling idea that someone had wanted the Whitleys gone. She knew there had to be a reason. Something far darker than anyone in the village realized. Her first real breakthrough came when she found a hidden compartment in the family's attic. It was cleverly concealed beneath the floorboards, and Sarah nearly missed. She had been looking for something, anything that could explain the family's disappearance, but all she had found up until now were dead ends. The compartment was small, almost too small for anything of real significance, but inside, Sarah discovered a box. The box was old, stained, and had a faint musty odor. At first glance, it seemed like nothing more than a dusty collection of keepsakes. But as she opened it, her breath caught. Inside, there were papers, old papers, some yellowed with age and brittle to the touch. But the most disturbing part wasn't the papers themselves. It was the name written on them. The name was unmistakable. Whitley. Sarah's heart raced as she pulled them out, one by one, carefully reading the faded words. The papers were dated back to the early 1800s, long before Thomas Whitley's family had moved into the house. They described the land, the original owners, and most troubling of all, a set of cryptic symbols that Sarah recognized immediately. She had seen these symbols before. They were part of the artwork in the Whitley children's book, but this time they were more elaborate, more sinister. The pages seemed to describe a ritual, though the exact details were hard to make out. Some words were completely illegible, as if they had been intentionally scratched out or erased. Sarah's pulse quickened. These weren't just old documents, they were clues. The more she examined the papers, the more she realized that the Whitley family was tied to something much older than they had ever let on. It seemed as though they had been involved in something far more insidious, something rooted in ancient rituals. But what did this all mean? Why would the family seemingly ordinary be connected to something so dark?
As Sarah continued her search, she uncovered a pattern of strange occurrences that had been happening in the village for decades. It seemed that every few years, another family would disappear without a trace. In some cases, it was as if the entire family simply vanished. In other cases, people went missing one by one, leaving behind nothing but strange symbols drawn on the walls of their homes. The townspeople had always assumed these were just coincidences or isolated incidents, but now Sarah wasn't so sure. She turned to the town's archives, hoping to find any records that might tie these disappearances to the Whitleys. It took several more weeks of digging, but she finally found something, an old journal buried in a forgotten corner of the records room. The journal had been kept by the town's first sheriff, a man named Eli Turner, who had been investigating the very first disappearance in Greendale over a century ago. The journal was worn, with pages that had been torn and stained, but what Sarah found inside made her stomach turn. It seemed that Eli Turner had suspected that the disappearances weren't random at all. In fact, he believed they were connected to a secret group that had lived in Greendale for generations. According to his notes, this group had been responsible for an ancient ritual, one that involved the bloodline of certain families in town. The Whitleys, it seemed, were part of that bloodline. Sarah's mind reeled as she read through Eli's journal. He had written that the group would perform certain ceremonies, rituals passed down through the centuries. These ceremonies, he believed, were meant to purge the bloodline of those who were unworthy and to ensure that only those of pure blood would remain in the town. It was a twisted belief in power and purity, and it explained why the Whitley family seemed so strangely distant at times. It also made sense of the strange symbols Sarah had seen in their home. They weren't just decorative, they were part of a larger ancient code, one that only the chosen few in Greendale understood. Sarah's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. The journal entries grew more frantic toward the end. Eli Turner had written that he had uncovered something horrifying. The bloodline of Greendale's founding families was far from pure. There had been generations of inbreeding, of hidden relationships meant to keep the bloodline clean, and all of this was tied to the land itself. As he closed in on the truth, Eli Turner had written that he had been threatened. He spoke of receiving anonymous warnings and feeling as if someone was watching him, and then in the final entry, he wrote that he had seen the ritual performed. It was the last thing he ever wrote before he disappeared. The journal ended abruptly, with no mention of what had happened to Eli Turner, but the meaning was clear. The disappearances were no accident. They were part of something much darker, something that had been happening for centuries. And now it seemed, the Whitley family had become part of this twisted legacy. Sarah felt her heart pounding in her chest. She now understood that the Whitleys hadn't just disappeared, they had been taken. It wasn't a random act of violence, it was the continuation of an ancient, horrifying tradition. The Whitley family had become the latest victims of a ritual that had begun long before they even moved to Greendale. And as Sarah pieced together the final details, she realized that her search for the truth might cost her everything. The Whitleys were not the first. They were simply the latest in a long line of families who had been consumed by this darkness. And now Sarah knew that the town of Greendale itself was a part of this dark legacy. There was no escaping it. Not for the Whitleys, and not for her. The more Sarah uncovered, the more she began to feel the weight of the town's dark secret pressing in on her. Greendale had always been a quiet, picturesque town, a place where neighbors knew each other,
and children played in the streets without fear. But beneath the surface, Sarah had uncovered a truth, so dark it had been buried for generations. This wasn't just about a missing family. It was about a community built on silence, secrecy, and blood. Sarah felt an unshakable sense of dread as she sifted through more documents. She was starting to piece together the true extent of the horrors that had occurred in Greendale over the years. The disappearances were no coincidence, and the Whitleys weren't the first family to vanish. There had been others before them, some stretching back centuries, each one leaving behind only cryptic symbols and whispered rumors. The more she learned, the more Sarah realized that the Whitley family wasn't just caught up in the ritual. They were a key part of the town's history. Was filled with stories of powerful families, old money, and a bloodline that stretched back to the founding days of Greendale. The Whitleys had been part of that legacy, one that had been preserved and protected for generations. But as Sarah dug deeper, she began to realize that the bloodline was not just about power. It was about something far more sinister. The town archives contained clues, but they were incomplete. Pages were missing, sections were burned, and the few records that remained painted a picture of a town that had been built on lies. The founding families of Greendale had made pacts with one another, pacts that bound them to a secret, hidden world of rituals, ancient ceremonies, and blood. These families had protected each other's secrets for generations, ensuring that the dark truth of the town's founding never saw the light of day. But Sarah was determined to find the truth. The Whitleys had disappeared, but their story wasn't over. She had to know what had happened to them, and why. She felt an urgency, as if the answers were just beyond her reach. But the deeper she dug, the more she realized that the answers would come at a price. Sarah's search led her to an old church on the outskirts of town. It was a place that many in the town avoided, a crumbling building that had been abandoned for years. The church had once been the heart of the community, but over time it had fallen into disrepair. The windows were broken, the doors were boarded up, and the air around it felt heavy, as if the very ground beneath it was saturated with history. Inside, Sarah discovered something that made her blood run cold. The walls of the church were covered in strange symbols, the same symbols she had seen in the Whitley house. They were etched into the wood, carved into the stone, and even painted in faded colors on the walls. The symbols were everywhere, a constant reminder of the town's dark past. But what struck Sarah the most was the altar. It was hidden in the back of the church, behind a heavy wooden curtain. The altar was old, worn by time, but still standing, and on it, Sarah found a single book. The pages were yellowed, the cover cracked, and the spine was frayed. But as she opened the book, Sarah knew she had found something important. The book was filled with old rituals, ceremonies that had been passed down through the generations. Some of the pages were illegible, the ink faded beyond recognition, but what she could read sent a chill down her spine. The rituals weren't just ceremonial. They were designed to bind the people of Greendale to something much older, something far more dangerous. They were meant to preserve the bloodline, to ensure that the town's secrets remained hidden, no matter the costs. Sarah's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. The rituals described in the book were disturbing, each one more twisted than the last. Some spoke of sacrifices, others of offerings made in secret, in the dead of night. The most unsettling part of the book, however, was a passage that described a final ritual, the ritual that had sealed the fate of the Whitley family. The ritual was meant to cleanse the bloodline, to ensure that only the purest blood remained in the town. The Whitleys, it seemed, had been chosen to be the final participants in this dark ceremony, and as Sarah read the details of the ritual, she realized with a shock that it had been carried out. The Whitleys hadn't just disappeared, they had been sacrificed to maintain the town's power. The more Sarah pieced together, the more she understood. Greendale had been built on this dark tradition, a legacy of blood and silence that had lasted for generations. The Whitley family had become a part of that tradition, and now their disappearance was just another chapter in the town's dark history. But what truly disturbed Sarah was the final line of the book. The blood will always call. It wasn't just a warning, it was a promise. The bloodline would continue, no matter what. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what she had uncovered. The town of Greendale wasn't just cursed. It was controlled by something ancient, something that had been waiting for the right moment to strike again. And Sarah realized with a sinking feeling in her chest that she had uncovered something much darker than she had ever imagined. The Whitleys hadn't just been victims of a random tragedy. They had been the latest in a long line of sacrifices. Sacrifices that were meant to protect the town, to keep its dark secrets hidden. But now that the truth had been uncovered, Sarah knew she was in grave danger. She had learned too much, and the forces behind the disappearances would stop at nothing to silence her. Sarah's mind raced with the horrifying realization that the Ashbourne bloodline, once thought to be lost in time, had woven itself into the very fabric of Greendale. The more she uncovered, the deeper the town's secrets seemed to burrow, hiding in the shadows, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to unearth them. Every step forward brought with it a mounting sense of dread, as though the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for Sarah to make a misstep. As she pieced together the fragments of the Whitley family's tragic fate, something unsettling began to happen. People in Greendale, those whom she trusted and considered friends, began acting strangely around her. They were distant, evasive. When she asked questions, their eyes darted away and they mumbled vague answers. At first, she thought it was just paranoia, the result of her increasingly dark discoveries. But the unease settled deep in her bones. She was no longer sure if the town's odd behavior was simply a product of years of fear, or something far more sinister. The people she thought she could trust, locals, police officers, even the town's librarian, seemed to know more than they let on. Sarah began to wonder if they were all complicit in some twisted conspiracy. The tension in the air grew thick, like a storm that was about to break, and she felt as though invisible eyes were constantly watching her every move. It was as if the town itself was alive and it resented her efforts to uncover its dark past. One evening, Sarah decided to confront the local historian, a man named Franklin Hartley, whom she had come to know in her research. He was an elderly man, quiet and reserved, and his collection of old books and town records had been invaluable in her search for answers. But when she arrived at his house that night, something felt off. The house was dark, the windows covered with heavy curtains, and the air around it was strangely still, as though the entire building was holding its breath. She knocked, but no answer came. Sarah's heart pounded as she pushed open the door, which creaked eerily in protest. Inside, the house was untouched by time. Old furniture sat covered in sheets, the dust thick in the air. But there was something else. A faint, unsettling smell of decay lingered in the atmosphere, and Sarah's skin prickled as she stepped inside. She called out Franklin's name, but her voice echoed back to her, hollow and empty. Something wasn't right. She moved cautiously through the house, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting. She reached the study where Franklin's work was usually scattered across his desk. Old maps, papers filled with notes, and dusty volumes of town histories. But when she stepped inside, she found the desk completely cleared. Only one thing remained: a large, leather-bound book. Her hands trembled as she approached it. The book was ancient, its cover cracked and stained with age. She could feel the weight of it in her hands, as though it was holding secrets that were far too heavy for anyone to bear. The title was worn away, but the spine was etched with strange symbols, symbols that looked eerily familiar. The same symbols that had appeared in the Whitley house, in the old church, and scattered throughout the towns. Sarah opened the book carefully, her heart thudding in her chest. Inside, the pages were filled with handwritten text. The ink faded but legible. The words seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as if the book itself was alive. She began reading, her eyes scanning the pages hungrily, desperate for any clue that would explain the horrors she was uncovering. What she found was more terrifying than anything she had imagined. The book spoke of an ancient pact, a pact that had been made by the founding families of Greendale, including the Whitleys, the Hartleys, and several others. The pact was forged in blood, a promise to maintain the town's power and keep its dark secrets hidden. But it was not just a pact of silence, it was a pact of control. Those who were chosen to inherit the town's power would be bound to it, marked by the symbols in the book, and required to perform certain rituals to preserve the balance between the living and the dead. As Sarah read further, the chilling details began to make sense. The Whitleys hadn't just been victims, they had been key players in this dark game. Their family's disappearance was no accident. It was part of a cycle that had been playing out for generations. The bloodline had to be purged, cleansed, to ensure that the pact remained unbroken. And now, as the last remaining link to the Whitley family, Sarah was being pulled into the same web. But what struck her most was the last entry in the book, scrawled hastily, as if written in fear. The entry was a warning. The bloodline calls, the Watchers are awake, and if you refuse the call, the shadows will consume you. Sarah felt the weight of those words settle over her like a cold blanket. The Watchers, who were they? And why was she hearing them now? Her thoughts were interrupted by the creak of the floor behind her. She spun around, her heart racing. But there was no one there. The house was still. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch longer, reaching out toward her. And then she heard it, a faint whisper, like a breath carried on the wind. "You've opened the door." The voice was barely audible, but it was unmistakable. It was the same voice she had heard in her dreams, the same one that had haunted her every step of the way. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized she wasn't alone. The Watchers were real, and they were here.
She bolted from the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know if the whispers were a warning or a promise, but she knew one thing for certain. She had crossed a line. The town of Greendale wasn't just hiding its past, it was actively protecting it, and the Watchers were its enforcers. Sarah ran through the house, desperate to escape, but the door was locked. Panic gripped her as she turned, searching for another way out. The walls seemed to close in around her, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. The Watchers had been watching her from the beginning, and now there was no way out. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps as she backed away from the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, not just by the townspeople, but by something far older, far more dangerous. The whispers had faded, but their presence lingered in the air, like a thick fog. They weren't just voices in her head, they were real. The Watchers were real, and they had been waiting. She frantically searched for another exit, her mind racing with the implications of what she had just uncovered. The book had spoken of them, shadowy figures who moved unseen, whose eyes were always upon you, whose influence stretched across the generations. They had been the ones to ensure that Greendale's dark secrets remained hidden, that the pact was kept, and that the bloodline of the Whitley family never truly disappeared. Suddenly a faint sound broke the silence, the slow creak of the front door opening. Sarah froze, her heart skipping a beat. She knew she was alone in the house, or at least she had been. But now, the door was open, and it had not opened on its own. A chill ran down her spine as she cautiously approached, her hand trembling as she gripped the edge of the door frame. The hallway beyond was dark, the flickering light from the street lamp outside casting long shadows that seemed to twist and sway like living things. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely more than a whisper. But there was no answer, only silence. She stepped out into the hall, her senses on high alert. Something was wrong. The house, once so still, now seemed alive with the tension of something about to happen. Her eyes darted back and forth, but there was nothing, no footsteps, no movement. Then she heard it again, the faint sound of whispering, growing louder, coming from the kitchen. The whispers were low, indecipherable, like voices speaking in a language she didn't understand. The sound was both comforting and terrifying at the same time, like a lullaby sung by something ancient and malevolent. "No," Sarah whispered to herself, shaking her head. "This isn't real. This isn't happening." But it was happening, and she couldn't deny it any longer. The Watchers were real. They were here. With a deep breath, she turned toward the kitchen, her steps slow and deliberate. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the refrigerator's light, spilling through the crack in the door. She reached out, her hand brushing the cold metal, and pushed the door open. Nothing. The kitchen was empty, just as it had been the last time she had checked. But the whispers were louder now, more insistent. They were coming from the pantry,
a small room tucked away in the corner of the kitchen. Her pulse quickened as she moved toward the pantry. Every instinct told her to run, to leave, to forget everything she had uncovered. But something else, something darker, pulled her forward. She needed to know. She had to know. Sarah grabbed the doorknob and twisted. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but shadows and the faint smell of stale bread and old wood. The whispers were now a dull hum, as though the very walls were speaking to her. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the shelves, each one stacked high with jars of preserved fruits, vegetables, and canned goods. But at the far end of the room, something caught her eye. A faint glow, barely visible at first, but growing stronger with every step she took. It was coming from a small, unmarked box, nestled among the cans of beans and tomato sauce. The glow was soft, ethereal, like the faint shimmer of moonlight on water. It was the only thing in the room that seemed to move, its light pulsing in time with the whispers that now seemed to reverberate through the very air around her. "What is this?" Sarah whispered to herself, her hand shaking as she reached for the box. The closer she got, the stronger the pull became, like an invisible hand gripping her heart. She lifted the box carefully, feeling its weight in her hands. It was cold, almost too cold, as though it had been stored in a place far darker than the box was made of old wood, its surface worn and scratched, but the glow that emanated from it was unmistakable. Without thinking, Sarah opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a small, weathered jar. It looked familiar, the same size, the same shape as the jar she had seen in the Whitley house, the same faint carvings etched into the glass, the same cloudy liquid inside. But it wasn't the jar itself that caught her attention. It was the figure inside, a small, perfectly preserved hand. Her breath caught in her throat as she leaned closer to inspect it. The hand was delicate, almost childlike, with pale, translucent skin. It seemed to glow faintly, casting an eerie light in the darkness of the pantry. The hand was contorted, its fingers curled as if frozen in time. But what made Sarah's blood run cold were the markings on the palm. They were the same symbols from the book, the same symbols that had been carved into the walls of the Whitley house, the same ones that had haunted her since she first stepped foot in Greendale. Her fingers trembled as she reached to touch the jar. The moment her skin made contact, the room seemed to shift. The air grew thick and heavy, the whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. The shadows in the corners of the pantry began to twitch, moving of their own accord, as though something was waking from a long slumber. And then, just as suddenly, the room fell silent. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she pulled her hand back. She didn't know what had just happened, but she knew one thing for sure. The Watchers were no longer a distant threat. They were here, in this room, and they were watching her. She slammed the box shut, her hands shaking. She had to leave. She had to get out of the house before whatever had just stirred in the darkness consumed her too. But as she turned to run, she froze. At the doorway stood a figure. It was tall, thin, and wrapped in shadows. Its face was obscured, but Sarah could feel its eyes on her, cold and unblinking. And then, in the dead silence of the pantry, the whispering began again. "You've opened the door." The figure in the doorway didn't move, its presence a solid wall of darkness that blocked Sarah's only escape. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest as she stumbled back, trying to steady her breath, trying to make sense of what was happening. The whispers, now sharp and fragmented, filled her mind, drowning out all other thought. "You've opened the door," the voice repeated, though its tone was colder now, more deliberate. It wasn't a warning, it was a judgment, a truth. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. The figure in front of her seemed to loom larger with each passing second, its form rippling in the dim light. Was it human, or something else entirely? The whispering grew louder, the voices now forming a chant, a rhythmic hum that echoed off the wall. The pantry, once ordinary, now felt like a tomb, suffocating in its weight. The jar, still clutched in her trembling hands, felt heavier, as if it had absorbed the very air around her. The symbols etched into the glass pulsed with an unnatural glow, casting eerie shadows on the shelves. "Who are you?" Sarah finally managed to rasp, her voice sounding far too small. In the vastness of the room, the figure shifted, just slightly, and then it spoke. "We are the ones who wait. We are the ones who guard." The words weren't directed at her, as much as they were directed through her, seeping into her skin, burrowing into her bones. She could feel the weight of history in the air, the sense that something had been waiting for this moment, for longer than she could comprehend. "God, God what?" Sarah whispered, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. The figure moved then slowly, deliberately. It didn't walk in the way a person would walk. It glided, shifting from one shadow to the next. It seemed to move, not through the physical space of the pantry, but through the space between seconds, between breath. "You've come to awaken the truth," it said. "But truth have consequence. The door you've opened is the door to a past buried so deep that it cannot be unearthed. Without cost, you will pay." The words echoed in Sarah's mind, repeating over and over, until they felt like they were carved into her thought. She looked down at the jar in her hands, her eyes drawn to the small preserved hand inside. She felt a sickening pull, an urgency to know more, but at the same time, every fiber of her being screamed for her to run, to leave the house, to flee this place before whatever was tied to it claimed her too. But the figure's voice stopped her. "You have already opened the door, child. You cannot close it now. Not without consequence. Not without the truth." Sarah's hands trembled as she clutched the jar tighter, the cold glass biting into her palms. She felt the pull of the whispers, the weight of the watcher's gaze on her back. Whatever had been waiting for her to find this, whatever had been waiting for her to make this discovery, was now ready to reveal itself. "What truth?" she asked, her voice barely audible, though she knew she would regret asking the question. The figure stepped closer, its form becoming clearer in the dim light. It was no longer a shape, no longer a shadow. It was a person, or had been once. Sarah could see the outline of a face, pale and gaunt, the features distorted by time and decay. Its eyes, if they could still be called eyes, were hollow pits, dark and unblinking, and yet they stared at her, staring through her, as if they could see into her very soul. "The truth of the Whitley family," the figure whispered, its voice crackling like dry leaves in the wind. "The truth of what they did to protect themselves, the blood that stains this house, this land, and all who dare disturb it." Sarah's stomach churned. She knew there were things about the Whitley family that were hidden from the public eye, things buried under years of silence. But she had never expected this. She had never expected to uncover something so deeply twisted, so dark, that it was meant to stay forgotten. The bloodline, it was never meant to fade. The figure continued. It was meant to grow, to strengthen, but it couldn't, not without the price, not without the pact. "Pact," Sarah echoed, though she was already beginning to understand. She could feel it now, the weight of her discovery. It wasn't just a mystery about a family who vanished. It was a curse that had stretched across generations, feeding on the blood of those who dared to inherit the secrets. The figure didn't respond immediately, instead, drawing closer to her, its presence becoming almost suffocating. The shadows around it seemed to pulse, to breathe, as though the very room was alive. The whispers that had once sounded so distant were now inside her, echoing in her mind, urging her to listen, to understand. "You must understand, Sarah Whitley," the figure said, its voice low, almost tender. "You were the last to know, the last to carry the burden. The others, they were never meant to survive. But you, child, you were different. You were always meant to find." Her breath caught in her throat. The figure had called her by name, and for the first time, she understood the true weight of her connection to this place, to the Whitley family. She wasn't just a curious outsider anymore. She was tied to this curse, bound by blood to a family that had never truly left the earth, whose legacy was etched in shadows and secrets. Her knees buckled as the full impact of the revelation hit her. She had never wanted this. She had never wanted to be part of this dark history. But there was no turning back now. The whispers, the shadows, the watchers, they were all part of her now. Whether she liked it or not, the door has been opened, the figure said softly, its voice almost a whisper in the dark. And now, the past will come for you. It will come for all of you. It always does. The walls of the house felt tighter now, the air colder. Sarah's fingers gripped the jar, so tightly that her knuckles turned white, the faint smell of decay still lingering in the air. The whispers had settled into a constant hum, like an insect buzzing in her ear, relentless and unnerving. She couldn't escape them, not in her mind, not in her body. The voices were there, embedded in the house, in the air, in the very fabric of her being. But the figure that had stood before her, the one whose presence filled the room with a suffocating darkness, was gone. Its words lingered, however, each one like a weight pressing on her chest, a reminder of her newfound connection to this place, this cursed lineage. The last words it had spoken to her played over and over again in her mind. The past will come for you. The air felt colder now, more unnatural. Sarah had heard stories before, rumors passed down from people who had lived here long before, whispers about the Whitley family, about their strange disappearance, about how their legacy had been erased from the history books. No one had dared ask why, or if they did, they were quickly shut down. Now, she knew why. It wasn't just the house that was haunted, it was the very land, the very bloodline that coursed through her veins. There was something in the walls of the house that had never left, something that was waiting, watching, feeding.
Sarah slowly turned to the stairs, her feet feeling heavier with every step. She could hear them now. The whispers, they weren't just in her mind, they were all around her. The house had come alive, as if it had been waiting for her to return, to finish what had been started long ago. At the top of the stairs, Sarah paused, staring at the long hallway before her. She had only explored a fraction of this house, and yet it felt as if she had already uncovered its darkest secrets. What else was hidden in this place? What other truths waited to be unearthed? The air grew thicker as she stepped forward, each creak of the floorboards beneath her feet sending chills through her spine. The house seemed to be pushing back against her, as though it was alive, resisting her every step. But Sarah couldn't stop now. She had to know. She had to understand what was happening, why she had been chosen to uncover these truths. The door at the end of the hallway loomed ahead, its edges dark and twisted, as if it had been there for centuries waiting for her to find it. As she approached, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. They were coming from behind the door. She could feel it. The house was calling to her. Her hand reached for the door handle, but before she could touch it, a voice, not from the walls but from deep within her mind, spoke. "Don't go in." She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The voice was unmistakable, familiar even, but she couldn't place it. The voice of a warning, a plea for her to turn back. But how could she? How could she walk away now when she was so close? Her fingers curled around the handle, twisting it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing a dark room beyond. There were no windows, only shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly, as though they were alive, curling and shifting with an unnatural purpose. As she stepped inside, the air became even heavier. It was suffocating, thick with dust and age. Her eyes darted around, trying to make out the shapes in the darkness. The room was empty, save for an old wooden chest in the corner. The lid was cracked open, revealing nothing but darkness within. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she moved closer to the chest, her steps slow, deliberate. The closer she got, the louder the whispers became, until they were no longer whispers at all, but a cacophony of voices, a chorus of agony and fear. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with the noise, as if they were breathing in rhythm with her every step. She knelt down in front of the chest, her heart racing. The whispers were now so loud, so piercing, that she could feel them in her chest, vibrating through her ribs. She reached out to touch the chest, her fingers trembling, But the moment her skin made contact with the wood, a sudden silence fell over the room. The air was still. Her breath caught as she slowly lifted the lid of the chest. Inside, there was nothing, just a layer of dust and a single object at the very bottom. A small, unmarked book, its pages yellowed with age. Sarah's hands shook as she reached for it, pulling it from the chest and holding it before her. The cover was blank, but she could feel the weight of it. It was heavy, heavier than it should have been. The moment she opened the first page, the whispers returned, louder than ever, as if the book itself was alive, feeding on her fear. The words on the page were written in a language she didn't understand, but somehow they felt familiar. Her eyes burned as she tried to read them, as though the ink was seeping into her very mind, rewriting everything she knew. "This is the truth of the Whitley family," the voice whispered in her mind. "The price of immortality. The price of silence." She tried to close the book, but her hands wouldn't obey. They trembled violently, as if some force beyond her control was keeping it open. The words on the page twisted and shifted, becoming clearer with every passing moment. She could see them now, the names, the dates, the events, all the hidden truths of the Whitley family, all the dark bargains they had made to protect their bloodline. The truth was worse than she could have ever imagined. The bloodline wasn't cursed, it was cursed with power. Power that came at the cost of souls, at the cost of lives. The family had made a deal, generations ago, to protect themselves from death, to ensure their legacy would never end. But the price had been steep, and now Sarah was the final payment. Sarah's heart pounded as she read the pages, her mind struggling to comprehend the horror unfolding before her. She felt a cold sweat forming on her forehead as the words of the book seemed to pull at her very soul, unraveling the tight grip she had on her own identity. The Ashbourne family, or whatever they had become, had made a pact with something ancient, something far older than the land itself. The whispers she had been hearing for days were not just echoes of the past. They were the lingering remnants of the curse, the result of a pact made in blood and sealed with sorrow, to live beyond death. The book read, "One must relinquish their soul, and in its place they shall harvest the souls of others." The Ashbourne bloodline was never meant to end. It never shall. She gasped, her fingers trembling as she gripped the book tight. The air around her seemed to shift, becoming heavier with every word, suffocating her in a dense, suffocating fog. She could hear the voices more clearly now, no longer just whispers but screams, agonized, pleading, desperate. The walls of the house pulsed with their cries, and Sarah realized with a sickening jolt that the house itself was alive. It had been feeding on the souls of those who had lived within its walls, and now it was hungry for more. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the room, and the book fell from her hands. Sarah's breath hitched as she looked up, her eyes wide with terror. In the corner of the room stood a figure, dark, tall, and distorted. It was unlike any human she had ever seen. Its form twisted and elongated, as if it were not meant to exist in this world. Its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow hue, and its mouth stretched impossibly wide, a grin that seemed to devour the very light in the room. The air around it was cold, and Sarah could feel the temperature dropping, her breath turning to ice in her lungs. The creature did not move, but Sarah could feel it watching her, its gaze piercing her very soul, dragging her into the abyss of its void-like stare. She knew without a shadow of doubt that this was no ordinary ghost or spirit. This was the thing that had been lurking behind the Ashbourne name, the entity they had bargained with, the thing that had been feeding off the bloodline for centuries. It was the true legacy of the Ashbourne family. "You were chosen," the creature's voice rumbled, its words a deep, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very air. "Chosen to carry the weight of the Ashbourne name, to finish what was started." Sarah's heart raced in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She backed away slowly, her mind reeling from the revelation. She was no longer just a bystander in this twisted tale. She was now part of it, part of the cursed lineage, part of the unholy bargain that had been made long ago. "What do you want from me?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with fear. The creature took a slow step forward, its eyes fixed on her, and for a moment,
Sarah thought she might collapse under the weight of its gaze. Instead, it spoke again, its voice like a cold wind rustling through the dead branches of a long-forgotten tree. You have felt the pull, haven't you? The hunger, the desire to know. You seek answers, but those answers come at a price. Your bloodline is now bound to this house, to this curse. You are the last of them. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She could feel them sinking into her, wrapping around her heart, slowly squeezing the life out of her. The creature was right. She had always felt something inside her, a longing, a need to understand, to know the truth. But now, with the truth laid bare before her, she realized just how far the Ashbourne legacy stretched, how much it had cost, and how much it would continue to cost, even after the bloodline was gone. No, Sarah gasped, shaking her head. But deep down she knew it was too late. The house, the whispers, the haunting, the creature standing before her, all of it was part of her now. She had inherited it. She had become the very thing she feared. You are the keeper now, the creature said. Its voice was no longer a whisper but a roar, as if the house itself was speaking through it. The house will never be empty. The bloodline will never fade. You will carry it forward, just as they did before you. You will keep it alive, forever. Sarah stumbled backward, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Her body was frozen in place, caught between the truth she had uncovered and the fate she couldn't escape. The creature smiled, and in that moment, Sarah understood. The house wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by something far worse. The remnants of the Ashbourne family's curse. A curse that would never be broken. It had claimed every generation, and now it was claiming. What's done cannot be undone, the creature said, its voice fading as the darkness closed in around Sarah. The house will always remember. And with that, Sarah was swallowed by the darkness, her mind consumed by the whispers, her soul bound to the house for all eternity. The room was still, the silence almost suffocating. Sarah's mind reeled from the horror that had just been revealed, the realization of the Ashbourne legacy crashing over her like a tidal wave. Her fingers twitched as she reached for the doorframe, her heart hammering against her ribcage. The creature's words echoed in her mind. You will carry it forward, just as they did before you. But it was no longer just words. It was a reality that had ensnared her. She stepped into the hallway, her feet heavy as if the very air of the house was pressing down on her. The walls seemed to pulse, the whispers growing louder, swirling around her, urging her to stay, to embrace her fate. Sarah felt the bloodline coursing through her veins, and with it came the sharp, unrelenting hunger to understand, to know more. Every step she took felt like she was sinking deeper into the very bowels of the house, her soul intertwining with its dark secrets. The whispers were no longer faint. They were now clear, demanding, relentless. They pulled her forward deeper into the mansion, the heart of the Ashbourne legacy. She tried to resist, to pull away, but she was tethered, a part of something ancient, something unyielding. As she reached the grand staircase, she stopped. Her gaze fell on the mirror, at the top of the stairs, the same one she had noticed earlier, before the madness had truly begun. It was still covered in dust, yet it seemed to glimmer faintly in the dim light. She took a hesitant step toward it, her fingers trembling as they brushed against its cold surface. The reflection in the mirror was distorted, no longer just Sarah's face staring. In place of her own eyes there was the hollow, empty gaze of someone who had been consumed by the curse long ago. The Ashbournes, her ancestors, their souls, lost within the very walls of this mansion, their faces trapped in the reflection of this cursed mirror. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't the only one here. The house was filled with them, the spirits of those who had come before her, their lives extinguished by the very bloodline they had fought to preserve. You've joined them, a voice whispered behind. Sarah turned, her breath catching in her throat. But there was no one there, just the same dark, empty hallway, stretching endlessly ahead of her. Her pulse raced. The air felt thicker now, heavier, as if the weight of the Ashbourne curse was pressing down on her. The voices in the house had stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence that made her feel as though the very walls were closing in around her. The mansion seemed alive, as if it had become a part of her. Its hunger, its secrets now entwined with her own existence. She couldn't breathe, she couldn't think. She had become part of the story, part of the curse that had plagued the Ashbourne family for centuries. The final price had been paid. No, Sarah whispered, clutching at her chest. But she knew it was too late. The creature's words from earlier rang in her ears. The house will never be empty. The bloodline will never fade. You will carry it forward, forever. Her eyes blurred with tears as she staggered backward. She could no longer escape the truth. There was no way out. She had inherited more than just the Ashbourne. She had inherited the curse, the hunger that had driven the family for generations. And she would be the one to carry it forward. Her vision wavered. The house around her shifted. She could see the walls, the furniture, the very air thickening with darkness, growing oppressive, swallowing her whole. The whispers returned, louder now, like a chorus, a cacophony of voices from the past, from those who had come before her. They no longer spoke of curses or bloodlines. Now they spoke of her. Join us. It was no longer a question. It was a command. The walls of the house trembled as Sarah's feet moved involuntarily toward the door at the end of the hallway, the door that had been sealed for so long. Her heart thundered in her chest as she reached for the handle, her hand cold and clammy. The door creaked open, revealing a vast shadowy room, its center dominated by an altar. The altar, carved from dark stone, was bathed in an eerie light that seemed to emanate from nowhere. On it, a single object lay, the object she had been drawn to from the very beginning, the heart of the Ashbourne curse. Her blood ran cold. She had always known it was coming, but now that she was here, standing before the object of her inheritance, she could feel it. The darkness that had followed her, the hunger that had been with her all along, was finally awakening. The whispers grew louder, frantic now, urging her forward. They no longer spoke of the past. They spoke of the future. Her future. The future of the Ashbourne family. Take it, they whispered. Finish what we started. Her hand moved toward the altar, trembling, as though guided by an unseen force. She didn't want to touch it. She didn't want to take the final step. But she knew, deep down, that there was no choice. With a slow, reluctant motion, she reached out and grasped the cold ancient object that lay upon the altar. It was a lock of hair, blackened and twisted, as if it had been soaked in blood and time, and as her fingers closed around it, she felt the final seal of the Ashbourne curse lock into place. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat, as the room seemed to darken around her. The walls pulsed, the air thick with energy, with power. The whispers became deafening, rising to a crescendo, until they were no longer whispers at all. They were screams, and in that moment, Sarah understood. She wasn't meant to leave this place. She wasn't meant to break the curse. She was the final piece of it, the last in a long line of Ashbournes who had been doomed to this fate. The house wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by the curse of the Ashbourne bloodline. And now, Sarah was its keeper. The whispers ceased, and the house fell silent once again. But Sarah knew, deep down, that the silence wasn't peace. It was the calm before the storm that would begin again, and she would be the one to carry it forward. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more mysteries that will keep you on the edge of your seat.